Okay. So what did I do with it? What happened to our YouTube? Did I lose it? You can't possibly lose these things. YouTube to use. There it is. Getting better. The reason I stopped it, and we'll go back to it right away, is that's kind of what happens when the baby is developing. Remember, when I commented on that, that babies don't have the development. Everything's at 300, so there's no quote unquote counter current mechanism. it takes a couple of years to develop, which you're going to see all the way at the bottom of 1200. So it's a gradual thing that starts probably in maybe pre-birth, but certainly carries on into the early years of infancy. So I thought that's and she's got all these other ones that the renin angiotensin mechanism. There is some good stuff on this, and I was very happy we found it. It's gradually increasing. So I mean, they've got. So I mean, I thought it was fairly valuable, and I said she's got a bunch of them that are there. And what's interesting is the vasorecta, and it's all based on the reason it can occur is that hairpin turn. The loops have to be long, and the hairpin turns. That's what allows the gradient to develop. And what the vasorecta do is they're pulling out the solutes to keep that once the gradient is established to maintain it. And then the urea plays a role, like a companion role, to help maintain the osmolarity that's there. So it's very, and so you'll see, and you'll see that by the time most of the urine that we excrete, depending on whether we're relatively dehydrated, whether we're secreting ADH actively or not, whether we're under a stress situation, all of those kinds of things. But generally, the urine is maintained fairly constantly. And what happens overnight when it's busiest is when we get the most concentrated urine. That's why you use for pregnancy tests first morning urine, because it's going to be the most concentrated. That system is busy retaining the water, and so and most of us are aware of that. It's just the way it works, and it depends, and that's why alcohol inhibits antidiuretic hormone release, so you end up urinating more. That's why it has inherent problems associated with it, vis-a-vis what I commented before, because it impacts antidiuretic hormone, which helps to bolster your anticoagulant effect. And that's why in surgery people would bleed excessively, but they didn't really have a whole lot then. And the other problem with alcohol is the therapeutic level and the fatal level are very, very close. When alcohol is useful as a general anesthetic, you're a skosh away from the death level. And every so often, you see these drinking things. Fraternities were notorious for it back in the day. I mean, I was at a school where that was like that when they had the new pledges and all. Oh my God, drinking games, fraternities were banned. Kids would die. It's like, oh my God, monster. It's crazy. But I digress. Okay, so let me get back to where we're going with this. This is and I knew roughly at the renin-angiotensin. So I can buzz through these pretty fast, I would think, that we're here. And so and I'm a little bit ahead of it. So this is kind of where we were. It's an important control, the juxtaglomerular complex that you can see up there. Okay. So, I mean, you have a companion of sensors for salt content and a pressure sensor. And by and large, if our blood pressure is within normal, even if it's low or high, if you're not at shock levels or you're not at extreme malignant hypertension, basically your kidney can control itself. That's the beauty of the kidney. So we don't have to do a whole lot. I mean, there's certain things we do, whether we're exercising and we perspire a lot, we'll be 30. So most of the compensatory mechanisms are very straightforward. And so they have effectively these middle cells that interconnect and pass signals. And so you can see the close proximity that's there. So you have salt sensors here and pressure sensors here that are involved. So in general, 2.5 times an hour, all of your body's fluid is sifted through effectively. But we reclaim, and we call that filtrate. So it's everything but the formed elements and proteins, because they're too big to get through the holes. And so even you have enough, the blood still flows between the afferent and efferent arteriole, but it's considerably thicker. Potentially that can be a problem source. There's enough fluid, more or less, to keep it liquid, if you wanted to give it that way. So 99% of that filtrate. So theoretically, we're retaining everything we can and getting rid of what we don't want. And so metabolic waste, particularly nitrogenous, like urea, and then the three things I talked about before: filtration, reabsorption, secretion. And like I said, the fourth thing to me is that countercurrent mechanism, both the multiplier and the exchanger. And they just show you all these different things that are there, and forcing the fluids and fenestrated and podocyte. And that's more detail than you need. So it's about, and so this is the idea of the high pressure filter from a physiological standpoint. Why, when someone goes into shock, their kidneys shut down. This was what happened to me. It was a form of, it was a toxic shock, but it was kind of a hypovolemic shock. And you're, it's critical illness. Make no mistake about it. There's very limited criteria which puts you in. Because I can remember sitting there, and it's like, well, I need to admit you. Okay, ICU. So even in my semi-comatose state, I was like wanting to look up at the guy and go, what the fudge are you talking about? Okay. So understand, because of the high pressure and the relatively short journey, you have 55 millimeters of mercury compared to other this would tear apart other capillaries, not here. Okay. And the reason, as you can see, the efferent arteriole is high resistance with a diameter smaller than the afferent. So they're not the same diameter. The afferent is always larger. That's noteworthy, diameter-wise. So you have pressures from both. You have pressure even from the fluid in there trying to push it back in to the capillary. So, you're in a fluid environment, you have forces going out and forces going in. So you have the hydrostatic, your blood pressure, 55, and basically the sum of the colloid osmotic pressure and the fluid that's in the Bowman's capsule pushing it back in. But the net, it's about 10. And that's enough. The net is what gets you the outgoing. So the net filtration pressure, surface area, permeability. Most of the time, it's intrinsically controlled. Okay, so the intrinsic controls are what we do. The extrinsic controls are nervous and endocrine that take over. Nervous is principally fight or flight, sympathetic. The endocrine is that renin, angiotensin, aldosterone. You're going to see the 4 ways that it works. And we explore this more than once. We explore this in blood pressure and different things from a standpoint. So when your map is mean arterial pressure. So if let's assume we're a 120/80, as most people are around that normally. As you get older, your vessels are a little more taut. It gets a little higher. So my age, if you're under 90, the doctor's like, oh, good. Happy days. Which whenever I teach this class, it's usually over 200. No. So you take 120/80. The pulse pressure, the distinct difference is 40. Divide by a third. You get 13.3. You add that to the diastolic, the 80. So your map normally is around 93. Sure.
So whenever it's under that, would that be like kidney failure? Or
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it could be kidney failure. It could be shock. Shock is the most common reason.
And what happens if it be over? Would that just be
malignant hypertension?
Oh, okay.
I mean, you may have a tumor that's outpouring catecholamines, conceivably to that. There's going to be some phenomena that's could be neurological in nature. So I think tumor, I think damage, I think maybe spinal cord damage for some reason, infection, something along those lines. So it's a wide range that normally the kidney can take care of itself. It's there. They only could get my blood pressure by palpation. That's when somebody's in shock. And what happens when you take the blood pressure, a lot of times by palpation means you'll feel for when the pulse starts. Okay? I mean, the numbers didn't show up, and those stupid things that do it automatically are really fairly unreliable, by the way, if you wonder. Okay? And so, I mean, to feel this, and my pressure was probably 80 palp. I'm in trouble. And it was one of my original nursing students who was the intake nurse at St. Margaret's. Let's see. Trying to remember her name. Normally, I would remember all of that stuff. So there's different, the autoregulation, myogenic, and tubuloglomerular feedback, fancy names, local smooth muscle, increased blood pressure, muscle stretch, leading to, so if it's too much pressure, the afferent arterioles, the incoming vessels constrict, less blood flow, protects the glomeruli. Okay, the decreased blood pressure dilates the afferent, and that maintains it. Okay, helps maintain the normal GFR despite fluctuations in the blood pressure. Subtle changes allowing the fluid. If there's too much change that could come in and damage it, we slow it down. That macula densa is about salt. Okay. If the filtration, the GFR stands for glomerular filtration rate. If filtrate flow rate increases, it doesn't leave enough time for salt to be reabsorbed. Okay. So what's going to happen, I beg your pardon, for water to be reabsorbed. So it causes high, relatively speaking, levels. So the feedback mechanism causes constriction of the afferent arteriole, lowers the pressure, more time for the salt to be reabsorbed. And they just flip-flop it. That's there. Neurohormonal, sympathetic nervous system, we talked about already, etc. Extremely low blood pressure, releasing those, volume pressure. The renin-angiotensin is the big player. It can be stimulated directly by in fight or flight. It can be activated, and this is what we see the most when sodium chloride concentration is low. Okay, so at that point, there's going to be mechanisms that are effectively there to limit the amount of urine flow. So if the sodium chloride concentrations are low, you want to pull back or suck back in more fluid. Think of it that way. And the granular cells have less stretch. So these are the different things that involve it. The myogenic mechanism, the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism, nervous controls, etc. It's not the only ones. So other chemicals such as paracrines affect adenosine. So those are things like that. So think of what happens with those kinds of things. Adenosine, prostaglandins, some cells make their own, and this is the angiotensin is a primary thing that's used to do blood pressure. When I think of adenosine generally relaxes the process. So I don't know about you, but when I drink a bunch of coffee like we were talking about, usually you're having to go to the bathroom most of the time. So it has a stimulatory effect. That's there. And this is just definitions: anuria, low output, either blood pressure is too low, that's what's happening to me, okay, or any of these types of things that are there. And so that concluded that, and we'll look at the other, we already did, so there's not a ton left to do in this other PowerPoint, other than to look at maybe the roles of some of these things. So in resorption, tubular resorption, basically 65-70% of the stuff that you're going to retain is retained there. The bulk of the activity happens there. A lot of times you'll create gradients by resorbing stuff that you're going to secrete later. And that will create additional gradients for things to be excreted, if you want to think of it that way. So they have a nice chart that sort of summarizes it. And it can either go through the junction points if they're applicable, or through the cells themselves. I don't think that's a big deal for, vis-a-vis the MCATs that are there. Sodium across basolateral membrane, primary active transport plays a big role. You about 25% of your energy resources sitting here now at rest are in your kidney, utilizing these and there's a lot of co-transport, and as you might suspect, anti-transport that's going on with it that are there. So secondary active transport, okay, and all of the types of things are there. So sodium is a big player. Electrochemical gradient created by pumps, okay, needed for transport. So organic nutrients resorbed, glucose. Okay. Typically, and glucose is so pivotal vis-a-vis diabetes. And this is the one concept that I think you really need to remember. It's called transport maximum. This is why it's so important for diabetics to keep their blood sugars at a reasonable, even if they're hard to control. In the old days, if you could get them at 150 or less, you were happy. Even with really labile, which means unstable diabetics. Once the transport maximum for glucose that you could retain, that you could pull back into the bloodstream, for you and I is about 185 milligram percent. If it goes over that, not only does that spill into the urine, and then it has an osmotic effect, it pulls water with it, hence what diabetes is, glycosuria. So you're getting increased amount of urine production, increased amount of fluid being pulled by the sugar to balance out the concentration of the urine. And then all the other problems occur with it. Moreover, the longer those transporters are at maximum, the worse they function. So an uncontrolled diabetic, read that as over 200, let's say, their transport maximum gradually goes down to 175, to 170, to 165. So if they're not controlled, it weakens their control system that was there originally. That's a big factor. So, and a lot of these things, resorption of water. So there are openings in the proximal convoluted tubule that always water. It's these where antidiuretic hormone and aldosterone play a role in water reabsorption, either directly by these inserting porin channels in collecting ducts or by the role of aldosterone channels to pull sodium. And then again, Stein's good old Mary had a little lamb rule. Sodium goes, water is sure to follow. I love that. Here's the transport max. Okay. Saturated excess. So hyperglycemia, glucose spills. So most reabsorption, sodium and water, a lot of ions, most of the uric acid, half the urea, and urea is what we call urine. So it comes back in and it pulls other stuff along with it. So again, you're pulling Godfather 3. Every time you pull it out, every time I try to get out, they pull me back in. Great. Any Sopranos fans? See? That's the great line. And Silvio, who's German, who tours with Springsteen. Stevie Van Zandt, little Stevie, who looks like he's 6 feet tall in The Sopranos. And Gandolfini looks like he's 6'4", he's 5'11". Yeah. Magic of photography. I took a girl who was a year ahead of me in high school, had a recurring role on the production team, the writing, and she played, forgive me, not the first wife of Big Pussy, but the second wife. Her name's Toni Keown. She was like the second female lead in like Burt Reynolds movies and Chuck Norris movies. So she had a pretty good career. She's a year older than I. So that's the only one noteworthy that I can remember. When you grow up in New York City area, you're very close to. So a lot of kids who wanted to go and be on Broadway or be in movies or theater, they would go there. I mean, kids used to go, they'd go to like an open call and they come back and they were like the best dancer, the best looking and all that. You go, there's thousands. That's how hard it is to get in.
Is that the most famous person you probably grew up with, or?
Yeah, I have no idea. I don't know if she's that famous. I mean, I have to explain who it is for you to know. If I said Toni Keown, you wouldn't know who she was unless you looked her up, like on IMDb or have a Wikipedia page. I don't think I grew up with anybody terribly famous. The best known name is the guy who was murdered at Tree of Life Synagogue, Jerry Rabinowitz, who I graduated with. Unfortunately. So that if I said that, somebody go, I think I remember that from that Tree of Life incident. Yeah, it was a few years ago. And so we already talked about the loop. Here's the big player, antidiuretic hormone. And again, it's under the same kind of controls. It's salt or sodium-based controls. Principal cells of collecting ducts insert aquaporins, increase antidiuretic hormone levels, cause an increase in water reabsorption. Okay, all of those different ways it does it, not a big deal. So aldosterone, also collecting ducts and distal convoluted tubule. Synthesis of sodium and potassium channels and potassium pumps. Without aldosterone, we would lose it, and you can't. I mean, then all your resting membrane potentials. So increased blood pressure and decreased potassium levels are something that goes along with that. Here's the atrial natriuretic peptide that induces sodium to be excreted and water followed. When the atria cells are stretched, they release the ANP. Parathyroid hormone plays a role as well. So this is a good chart to look at. if you're preparing for MCATs, you can get an idea of what's being pulled out and what's being pushed, pumped in. Protons, ammonium, drugs. So there's a lot, and that's where there's a lot of excretion. And so you can see, and it gives you an idea of exactly what goes on. And then the rest of this is all about the countercurrent mechanism, secretion, drugs, bound to plasma proteins, metabolites, undesired, and there's a certain amount of urea and uric. We can tolerate a certain amount, but again, these are nitrogenous wastes, excess potassium, etc. And then this is the regulations, this is the countercurrent. We just did that, so you don't have to go through that again. And they show you the same basic chart. She just did it, I think, in a way that's visible. So you have flow going here, and you have the companion hairpin going here. So they both the exchanger, and they summarize it. I just think that was a better way to do that. And all the different permeabilities that are there. Students just go crazy when they see this. So it's that constant difference of 200 milliosmoles existing between the two limbs and the ascending limb and the interstitial fluid. And it keeps going and going and going and going. And they show you this series of slides, summarize it. So again, the vasa recta, permeable to water and solutes, is countercurrent, the hairpin turn. So sodium chloride and water with surrounding interstitial fluid moves through it. Okay. Blood inside remains isoosmotic with the surrounding interstitial fluid. So it resolves water and solutes without undoing the osmotic gradient. So you just effectively, it's an exchange. You're maintaining the particles there. So it's one of those things I think we underestimate the importance of interstitial areas. Well, we tend to overly focus on what's going on in organs and going on in cells. But I mean, here, the environment surrounding them, I think, is important as well. So again, without that gradient, we would not be able to raise the urine concentration. Okay. So what happens if we have too much dilute urine to a certain extent, we're losing fluid, antidiuretic hormone will maintain it, in aldosterone even more so. So all of those things are part of it. So when you're and it's like anybody, when you're dehydrated, you just know what it's like. It's like when I get my dog from Camp Bow Wow, he is not going to have to go until bedtime. He will be going a lot there. Here's the parts you mentioned about urea being part of it. This is a note. Inhibitors, alcohol, big player in that. Okay. Loop diuretics, like I said, we used a lot of those. Most famous of those, Julie, and they might have a question about that, is furosemide, known as Lasix. And the problem with Lasix is you lost a lot of potassium. They typically use that in a hospital to get fluid out in a hurry. They're in congestive heart failure and they have a catheter, so you can they're just trying to get the fluid to come out. They didn't find it. Osmotic diuretics are different. I mean, glucose is an osmotic diuretic, and I can't underestimate. I mean, you get so much from dipsticking a urine. I mean, people don't think of it that way. You don't need a whole lot more than it. We didn't have glucometers. Okay, that technology didn't exist. So how you monitor diabetics? They dipstick their urine, or they put like a stick inside a Eurostick as their urine was flowing, and look to see if they were spilling. And that would be, they'd have a sliding scale. It was +1. You give yourself 5 units or 10 units, whatever, how much insulin. And a lot of times we would take people when they had uncontrolled diabetes with multiple people on a zillion medicines, take them off everything, and you start using that. A lot of times that was the answer clinically. Let's just stop everything that's not life-threatening medicine and see where we start. So I really think that those are things, and this is how nowadays they estimate, and I'll finish up here. Like if I showed you my blood test based on the chemicals, they estimate your GFR. And it's a good thing to know whether because you can kind of track it. It's to do actual clearance, you had to take a substance that was neither absorbed nor secreted, and see how rapidly it clears. And generally, had to collect 24-hour urines. They used inulin, which is standard, and that's the number. But I mean, the estimates, as long as you're over like 65, you're basically not in any dangers. So, chronorenal disease, GFR less than 60 for 3 months, diabetes, high blood pressure, renal failure, and uremia is interestingly. I'll say this the last thing. The nugget is when somebody started getting close, they start not only they act crazy, they itch. Uremia in the blood, so increased amounts of uremic poisoning of those byproducts, itchy. Your BUN goes up. For whatever reason, it promotes that. Because my grandfather had that, and he started to get itchy and really unusual behaviors. He died when he was 86. And he had to have it. In the old days with infections, and he had to have a kidney removed, so he only had one. But he lasted a long time with that. Oh, God. What a good guy. Very fortunate. Thank you. It's very confusing.